And you had done the analysis on the players' references or profiles by that meeting?
All of the references, specimens that we had received to that date were processed and available for discussion on the 10th.
And you also had tested the sexual assault kit items?
Yes, we did.
Was it your normal practice to go through in meetings with clients all of the test results that you had gotten to that date, if you sat down with them?
It's our normal practice if they ask us. We don't require it. When someone does testing or we get specimens in from a sheriff or a police department or another crime lab, it's not required that they come in and talk to us, but it often happens. It often happens that if it's a North Carolina local case, they want to learn and they want to come up to speed, and so they'll come in and we'll sit down and spend time with them.
And did you do that in this case with Mr. Nifong?
Yes, we did. Yes.
And did you discuss generally with them what you had found with respect to the sexual assault kit items and the player references or profiles?
Well, yes, we went through. We actually specifically went through all of the results in this case with Mr. Nifong.
Okay. I'd like to. Did you go through? Did you spend time on the results with respect to the sexual assault kit items and the profiles at that meeting?
Yes. And
why did you do that?
Well, those were the items that we analyzed up to that point. And so, you know, that was what was on the table for discussion. There were those items. I think what you're asking is, did we focus on those items at all? And we did. And it was important to do that in this case, this specific case, because they were not classic results. They were not the best results. So they always, when you have a result that's not the best result or a classic profile, you need to exercise caution on how to interpret that information. And so we went through that with Mr. Nifong.
Okay. And did Mr. Nifong ask any questions during that April 10th meeting?
Yes.
I want to go through at least a couple of examples of the results that were completed and discussed at that meeting with Mr. Nifong on April 10th. If you'll look at Exhibit 210A, can you read that, Dr. Meehan, from where you are?
Yes.
Okay. And what is 210A? At least this is the top half of it.
Well, this is a plot or a graph of the DNA analysis that was obtained. Epithelial fraction of a stain that was lifted from the panties in the sexual assault kit.
Okay. And can you explain for the panel, for example, there are numbers underneath this. Can you explain what these documents are on the chart?
Yes, I can. And this is where now you just have to throw in a towel and put up with a crash course. All right. This happens to be the result from a Y chromosome test. So we would only see this if there were male DNA present. If there were no male DNA present, we would not see any of those little peaks. Right? And when we look at the Y chromosome, we look at a number of locations on the Y chromosome. And we look at 16 locations. And the reason we look at 16 different locations is because it gives us robustness in the test. The best analogy I have for this, and I can't take credit for it, I've gotten it from somebody else, would be if I told you that we wanted to identify an interstate, and that interstate ran through Burlington, Hillsborough, Meehan, and Raleigh. Okay. Now there are two interstates that run through some of those cities, but there's only one that runs through all of those. Okay, and that happens to be 40. Okay. Now if I said it ran through Burlington, Hillsborough, and Meehan, Well, you wouldn't be able to tell me it's 40 because you don't have enough information. There aren't enough locations on that interstate for you to identify it specifically to that interstate. It's the same thing with the Y chromosome. So along that chromosome, we look at different DNA locations, and we identify the DNA there using characteristics that we use at each one of those locations. And the more of those locations we identify, the more likely it is we can declare that it came from a specific individual.
Okay. And so when you're looking at one of these that has numbers associated, does that indicate anything about whether or not there's male DNA characteristics on this, in this case, the epithelial cell from Miss Mangum's, one of her panty stains?
Well, excuse me, it's not that there are specific, no specific number there indicates that there are male characteristics, but it tells me that there was DNA from a Y chromosome, which means there was male DNA on that evidence item that we lift, that stain. All right? Those genetic locations are designated and cataloged so that any other lab can go back to that same location and get the same result. And I don't know if you want to just keep going or...
No, it's okay. And so did you explain, when you sat down with Mr. Nifong and you went through these, did you explain to him what the significance was of finding any information on the YSTR testing in terms of the male, whether there was male DNA characteristics?
Well, I don't think we focused along those lines, which is where focus in this very protracted case has come about. I think what we focused on was that we did identify some male DNA on these panties, and that they were not, as I said earlier, ideal profiles. As you can see, there's a couple of, can I use your pointer?
Yes, sure.
How do you make it point?
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So each one of these boxes on the top represent the address that we looked at. That would be analogous to Burlington, Hillsborough, Mebane, and Raleigh along the highway. All right. Now, in this case, we don't have any result for this location. And that occurs also down here and also down here. So we don't have what we call a complete profile. It makes it less than a perfect profile. And the more of those that you miss out on or are unable to identify, the less likely it is you're going to be able to show identity or name that interstate. Right? So, and in this case, we discussed with Mr. Nifong that what we had were profiles. They were not perfect profiles. There was some male DNA there. And based on what we did have, though, we could say that none of the reference players match any of the information we have from these Y chromosome profiles.
Okay, and does that, if you look at the top there, does it indicate whether or not the male DNA that you found on this these panty stains was compared with a reference specimen and whether it matched?
Yes. And you'll see, I think we're going to look at a few more of these also. Up along the top of here is where our analysts make notations. A lot of those notations are made on the fly. But here, you probably can't read it well, but it says does not match, and it lists the specimen numbers that it was compared to, and it absolutely does not match. The way we declare a no match, for example, this is a 15. All right? If of all the suspects we have in a case, whether it's one suspect in a simple rape case or a complex case with 50 suspects, if none of our suspects have this 15, then they could not have provided the DNA to this profile, even though it's a weak profile.